Hello, everyone. As industrial economies emerge from the pandemic, demand for energy is soaring, and with it, energy prices. That is angering consumers and it's worrying governments. Here in Europe, natural gas is 4 times more expensive than at the start of the year. Now, as countries consume larger amounts of alternative fuels like coal, CO2 emissions are also on the rise, making the climate crisis even worse. It's certainly a complex issue which we want to try to explain as simply as possible and make some sense of it. So let's meet Mr. James Waddell, a senior global gas analyst at London-based Energy Aspects. James, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Can you unpack the causes for us, please? To what extent is the current crisis a result of extraordinary factors regarding the weather, disruptions by the pandemic, and to what extent is it bad policy?
Well, you're right. It has been a confluence of events that have got us to these extremely high prices that we're seeing at the end of summer and going into the winter period. Many different factors led to this, but what I'd highlight mainly is the fact we've had a big recovery in demand as we've come out of the pandemic, with more businesses being open and calling on more power and calling on more gas to service their businesses. And at the same time, we've not had supply returning to a pre-pandemic baseline. And there's 2 main items within that. One is the lack of Russian gas that we've been seeing coming into Europe, and the other is the lack of gas aboard LNG tankers, gas tankers that are normally shipped around the world, either to Europe or to Asia or to Latin America. Now, if we focus on the LNG side of things, well, we've had cold weather in Asia at the start of this year, which drew a lot of those gas tankers away from Europe and into the Asian balance. We then had a very hot summer, so those same gas tankers were then also sent to Asia to provide gas into power for cooling demand. We had very low hydro generation in Brazil over the course of this year, and that has also drawn gas tankers away from Europe. So that has been a major part of supply that has just been missing from the European balance over the course of this year. And the other main missing component is the amount of Russian gas. And what we've seen in terms of the data we've been recording is that those flows have really remained pretty much flat to 2020, which was, of course, the worst period of the pandemic and the demand destruction, and has really not stepped up into line with that increasing demand in Europe. Now, Russia is satisfying, as far as we can see, its contractual obligations with European clients, but what it's not doing is selling a lot of extra gas that it usually does on a discretionary basis, basically selling on the spot market.
You mentioned Russian gas, and of course, many fingers are pointing at Vladimir Putin, who has said Europe's crisis is self-inflicted. Is Europe's, James, reliance on Gazprom something we should be looking into?
It will be calling in to question the stability of gas supply into Europe. And it doesn't help, actually, a lot of the rhetoric that's coming out of Russia regarding if you, for example, give us access to the controversial Nord Stream 2 project, which is a big pipeline which is meant to deliver directly from Russia into northern Germany. Russia is saying, if you give us access to that pipeline, then we will give you more gas. And that really, to European policymakers, sounds like Russia is withholding supply from Europe in order to get the commissioning of this pipeline. So it is calling to doubt the stability and the security of supply that comes from the gas market, and that could accelerate transition away from gas towards renewables, for example. So it is a bit of a dangerous game that we're playing, but we've also got to remember that Russia is a long-standing energy partner with Europe. I mean, Russia has been supplying European countries since the days of the Soviet Union, way back in the 1960s. And it's not really in Russia's interest to push Europe too far away from gas and towards other commodities, while Europe remains such a key market for Russia.
So how long do you think this gas crisis is going to last? If If Russia shipped more gas in Europe, let's say, would that bring prices down significantly? Mr. Putin has also said that he first needs to take care of his own local demand before extending his supply to Europe.
Well, the European gas market is reacting very quickly and almost on a daily basis to small fluctuations in Russian supply coming into Europe. And what we've seen actually in recent days and since the middle of last week, Putin's promise to effectively supply Europe with more gas the moment that Russia's own injection campaign is completed, and that's around the 8th of November. So there's been quite a big sell-off over the last few days just on that anticipation of more Russian gas coming into the European balance. That said, we're a little bit skeptical about how much supply we are going to see coming from Russia. Russia keeps saying that it's not going to supply large volumes through Ukraine, which is the only major route with a lot of spare capacity to deliver into Europe, until it gets the Nord Stream 2 pipeline commissioned. And we think that could be sometime really late Q1 or into next summer. So if it doesn't have that capacity, we're not going to see huge flows coming into Europe over this winter, and really won't be until next summer that we see a really significant drop in European gas prices.
Do you think that this is going to prompt a long-term shift towards demand for coal and oil, and how is this going to affect the green transition, the transition to clean energy sources?
Well, in the very short term, what we have seen is that gas has been so expensive that the power sector has been calling on more coal fired generation in order to meet power demand. And there has also been an incentive to even trigger some fuel oil and low sulfur fuel oil and gas oil generation in Europe. Although across Europe, we've seen that at very low levels, to be honest, over recent weeks. So really it's been that increased call on coal supply to meet that power demand. Now, over the next decade, we are closing a lot of European coal-fired capacity. So that ability to switch away from gas towards coal is going to be diminished. And also we're retiring quite a lot of nuclear capacity across Europe, particularly in Germany. And that, again, is also going to step up that demand for gas. So gas demand is going to stay strong in the power sector over this decade. And high prices, if we don't get supply really ramping up enough to meet demand, is going to deliver a lot of windfall profits to companies that are able to trigger renewable projects. And so this should help accelerate the amount of investment going into the energy transition and towards renewable generation sources. But this is going to take time. This is going to take a decade or 2 decades to really see a meaningful reduction in the amount of gas-fired generation we have in Europe.
And let's finally reverse this question, James, with an eye to the future, hopefully the near one. Once that transition to clean energy finally happens, how do you predict it will affect energy prices? Will it bring them down, and is it going to reach consumers?
Well, what we will see eventually is that, if we have enough of the grid powered by renewable energy sources, then those are effectively at the point of delivery, those are almost a zero marginal cost. I mean, the costs related to renewables are all in the capital cost, as in the cost of installation and building the sites. But once they're already built, that cost generation basically falls to zero. So in the long run, we should be able to see much lower prices. On the flip side of that, though, is we are in the Northern Hemisphere and there's a big heating demand. So you need to build a lot of renewable capacity to meet those very cold days in winter when we need that supply. So there's also a big emphasis on storage. And if we don't find solutions to meeting those very high demand days in winter, we will have quite volatile prices in the future. So sometimes it can be extremely low. And we have seen negative power pricing in Europe already in the last few years in some countries. But at the same time, you can have extremely high prices. So there will be volatility unless we can start to find solutions for storage and demand response across Europe over the next couple of decades.
Right. Well, natural gas is having its moment in the sun, James. Certainly a tricky challenge for politicians in the coming months. It's good news. You're saying things will probably smooth out next year, but we've got a tough winter ahead of us, and governments should take measures to support vulnerable consumers. Mr. Waddell, James, thank you so much for your precious time today on our stream.
Thank you for having me on.